Okay, so we are live on the Chef Girl Nutrition Facebook page. I'm here live every Tuesday, same time and place with a cooking demo. So typically I'm focused on one ingredient and either talking about how we can prepare it, different ways that we can enjoy it, maybe demoing it in a recipe, and they all have a seasonal focus. So of course we are in fall now, so we're talking about a lot of different kinds of squash. So today we're talking all about spaghetti squash. So spaghetti squash is, which we've talked about with some of the other squashes, especially like butternut squash, right? Which actually, there it is right behind me on the counter. So it's an oddly shaped vegetable, right? So that always can cause some uncertainty about how to handle it and how to handle it safely. So we've kind of touched on this a bit, like I said, with the butternut squash, with our summer cooking series. We did this with the watermelon. So whenever we're handling something that's a little bit oddly shaped, and by that I mean that it doesn't really have a flat surface, or something just that's really large, we first want to kind of look at it and think about how can I make this a little bit easier for myself and also safer. So one of the first things is to be able to look at something like this squash and say, how can I create a flat surface here, right, to make it safer for me to cut it? So that's the first step. But I'm going to dive in a little bit into some other tips as we're going through how to prep this squash. And then we're going to roast the squash. So I'm doing another little Food Network trick, and I have a squash cooking in the oven now because the spaghetti squash takes like anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes or even more. Of course, the time varies depending on how big your squash is, but it takes quite a while to cook. So I don't want us to have to wait for this guy to cook up. So I have one in the oven that's already cooking. So I'll show you how we prep this guy to go in the oven for roasting, and then I will pull the one that's in the oven out and show you how to shred it up. So first tip for prepping the spaghetti squash is, and I'm going to just show you here, is to have a wet paper towel underneath your cutting board. So the wet paper towel under the cutting board helps prevent your cutting board from sliding. So when you're working with something like the squash that is really tough to cut through, it's enough that the squash is rolling around. You don't also need your cutting board sliding out of place. That could be very dangerous. So that's something that you can always do when you're cutting up anything, is put a wet paper towel under your cutting board to keep it from sliding around. But especially when you're working with something like the spaghetti squash that is a little bit more unstable to work with, you want to create a safer workspace for yourself. So that's one tip. My second tip is buying a smaller spaghetti squash. So it seems kind of common sense, right? But when you are shopping and you see all these different squashes, not just the spaghetti squash, but the butternuts, the honey nuts, the acorns, all of the different squashes, they come in a variety of sizes, right? So one simple thing that you can do is look for a smaller squash. And maybe that means buying two smaller ones instead of one really big one. But that's a simple thing you can do that just makes it a lot easier to handle because it's smaller from the get-go. So actually the one that I have in the oven now is even smaller. This one's like pretty average size, I would say, but there are ones that are definitely much bigger. And then the one I have in the oven is also smaller than this. So that's another thing. Just look for ones that are a little bit smaller and it'll make it a little bit easier to handle. Okay, the next thing is the knife that you're using. So we either want to use a really sharp chef's knife, a nice big, let me grab, I have this one here. So a nice big knife that's nice and sharpened. You don't want to use a dull knife. I've talked about this before, but a common misconception is that a dull knife is safer, but a dull knife while a dull knife might not cut you as easily if the knife were just, if you were just holding the knife, right? It's not going to cut you as easily because the blade is dull, but it becomes less safe than a sharp knife, because if you're using a dull knife and it's not sharp enough, right, you have to really saw at it. You have to really saw at whatever you're cutting in order to get that dull knife to go through. And all of that sawing is more risk for the knife slipping and then cutting you. Whereas a knife that's nice and sharp, that sharp blade is going to really, slide through whatever you're cutting more easily, and you're not going to have all of this sawing going on. So that's another thing. So either a nice sharp chef's knife, or what I'm going to be using is a serrated knife. So this is the serrated knife, or a bread knife. So it has these sharp prongs on the bottom. So these prongs, why I like to use a serrated knife for something like this, is the prongs on the serrated knife really latch into the outside of the squash, really latch onto that skin, because another thing here is that the skin is very smooth. There's no texture to it really. So there's nothing really for the knife to grab onto to get traction. So using the serrated knife is a way for it to really kind of latch onto the skin so that there's less risk of the knife slipping. Okay, so now we'll get into actually cutting it and the tips there. So I'm gonna pull this down and show you. Okay, so we want to create a flat surface, right? So rather than, certainly we can't cut through this stem, right? This is like woody and hard and you cannot cut through this. So we're gonna cut off both ends. So just hold really tight with one hand. So you see the serrated knife just really slides through there nice and easy. So now I already have one flat end. I just have a little container here that's gonna collect the garbage. And then we're gonna cut the other end. And I'm just cutting, you can see I'm just cutting the very ends. So I don't wanna actually get into the inside of the squash. We just want the very ends. But so now we have a flat surface on both sides. So based on how straight the cut is, you can see which side makes it, is like flatter and more stable for you, what feels more comfortable. So this way seems to be nice and stable. So now it's already a little bit easier, right? Because instead of trying to cut the squash, like look, it's rolling away from me, right, as I do that. So you don't want to have to be cutting the squash like this and have the risk of it rolling around. So I'm going to stand it up. I'm going to put my hand on the top of the knife to help give it some pressure. Whoop. This one went through pretty easy. And just really see how I'm kind of like, you can use the motion of the knife to kind of saw your way down there. All right, and then if it doesn't quite go all the way through, flip it around onto its other end and finish it from the other side. Okay, and there we go. So this is what we want to cut the squash lengthwise so that we get into our insides. Of course, these two halves are not quite even because of the way I cut it. I would worry less about that and more about keeping safe, right? So it doesn't need to be a perfect cut. It's more important that you are safe when you do so. Okay, so here we go. So now what we want to do is scoop out the pulp and the seeds from the center. Ooh, and that's just the other squash. So I'm going to just grab this guy and I'll show you also. Okay, so this is the one that is, I put in the oven before we started, so it's just roasted now. So what we're looking for to know that it's done, so we roast them flesh side down, so I'm going to flip them over with tongs. Okay, so you can see there. So what we're looking for to know if the squash is done we want it to be fork tender, okay? So we talk about fork tender all the time, which just means that a fork can slide through the center of whatever you're testing without any resistance. So you're not having to shove the fork in, it's just sliding in nice and easy. So I test the spaghetti squash from one of the thicker points of it, right? So from like the end over here. So I just slide my fork in. I'm doing this with one hand, it's kind of hard. Just slide the fork in. This is actually still a little bit hard. So I'm gonna put this in for like 5 more minutes, but it's almost there. And we'll finish prepping the other one before we get to this guy. All right, so back to this squash here, we're prepping it. So we have it cut in half now. So we just need to scoop out the pulp and the seeds. And just like we talked about with the butternut squash, you can clean off these seeds, dry them, and roast them and eat them. So I just scoop them out using a spoon. So just really kind of dig in there, use use a metal spoon and use the side of the spoon to kind of really scrape. And you just want to get all of the inside pulp out of there. And so that's also why I keep a garbage bowl here while I'm doing this, because these seeds can just kind of fly everywhere. And I just kind of use my hands to help it along, to help pull, because it's stringy on the inside, right? So sometimes you just kind of have to pull at it a little, right? You can see what I mean, like it gets stuck. So just pull that out. Okay. All right, so that's it, nice and clean. Do the other one. So it really is easy to prep it once you get to the point of it being cut in half. So I hope those tips were a little bit helpful to just help make it a little bit easier. The most important thing is this is not a time to like push yourself. If the knife is not going through easily, it doesn't feel like you can like safely, like you're nervous, right? And especially once you get nervous with your knife, that creates a more risky situation because you lose your confidence, right? So if it's feeling unsafe to you, there are a couple things you could do. You can put the spaghetti squash in the microwave. You can actually cook the spaghetti squash entirely in the microwave. Just like if you've ever cooked a sweet potato in the microwave, it's the same kind of idea, where you pierce the outside with a fork all around it to make some holes for steam to come out, because otherwise it could explode from the heat in the center of it. So you want to poke some holes in it. You can put it in the microwave. So if you really can't get through the squash, poke some holes in it, put it in the microwave in a microwave safe baking dish, just for like 5 or 10 minutes, just to soften it. So then you can still roast it. This would just be to help soften it a little bit to make it easier to cut through. So that's one thing you can do. Another thing is cut it crosswise. So if it's really giving you issue, or if it's really big, just putting it back together here, cut it crosswise to make it a little bit smaller to deal with. You can still roast it, just the same. It doesn't have to only be cut like this. You can still cut it crosswise. You can cut it in rings. Keep cutting it crosswise and cut it in rings and roast the rings. So you don't have to cut it lengthwise if it's just not working for you. Better to abort mission and try something different than to risk hurting yourself. And I'll even the one that is cooking right now, that one, even though it was smaller, was much harder. This one, the knife went through pretty easy. The one that's in the oven now, I had a hard time cutting it for sure. So some of them are just harder than others. So better to take some precaution than to try and do something that can get you hurt. Okay, So we're ready to get this guy in the oven. Just gonna move this aside, pull this over here. Okay, so we just have a baking sheet lined with parchment paper. You can not line the baking sheet or you can use aluminum foil, either way. And we're just going to drizzle some olive oil over. So just kind of drizzle it in the middle. And then we're gonna use our hands, put more in this one. We're gonna use our hands to just rub it around the middle and the sides here. Okay, so it's just, I don't know, like a teaspoon or so of olive oil on each one. It's not too much, it's just enough to get it nice and coated. And then we'll hit it with a nice sprinkle of salt and pepper. Okay. Some nice salt and pepper. Of course, you can season it with whatever you want. We're just keeping it pretty simple because we'll talk about some ways to enjoy the spaghetti squash once it's cooked, but generally we're, maybe adding it to something. So I like to just keep it simple with olive oil, salt, and pepper, and then we can flavor it up with whatever we're eating it with. And then flip it flesh side down, just like this. And it's going in the oven. Let me pull out the other one. Okay. So that will go in the oven at 400 degrees for, like I said, like 30 minutes is like the minimum, I would say, for a smaller spaghetti squash, up to like 45, 50, maybe even 60 minutes if it's a really big one. So check it at the 30-minute mark, and if it's not done, put it in for maybe 5 to 10 minutes more at a time, depending on the size of it. So, I didn't time this one, so I'm gonna time this one for 30 minutes. So this one that just came out of the oven ended up being in there for 35 minutes. So, okay. There you go. I'm going to bring a towel over. Bring right here. Okay. So, can talk a little bit about the spaghetti squash. I'm going to let it cool down just a little bit before I go to handle it. But I will show you what it looks like out of the oven. So it gets nice and caramelized. Right, that olive oil on there helps to get it, you can really see. You can see like the brown edges around the sides. So that's why you really want to try to rub the olive oil all around the sides there. Because the spaghetti squash is quite sweet, right? So it's actually less starchy than some of the other squashes that we've been working with. But there is a lot of sugar, natural sugar is in it. I don't want it to sound like there's a lot of natural sugar in this spaghetti squash. It has a pretty sweet flavor when you eat it on its own. So it does caramelize very nicely. And that's another reason to put it flesh side down so that it gets that browning on the outside. The spaghetti squash, of course, is also high in fiber, high in antioxidants, so definitely health supportive. So we can talk about some ways that we can use the cooked squash once we have it, right? So you probably see a lot of recipes of using the spaghetti squash as like a boat and filling it. So that's one that's what my favorite way to enjoy it is to fill it with something. So I actually have a recipe coming up in the fall ebook that is a stuffed spaghetti squash that's stuffed with a white bean chili. So chili is a nice thing to put in there. And you can either scoop out the inside of the spaghetti squash and mix it with whatever you're stuffing it with. So like for the chili recipe, for example, you could either scoop all of the spaghetti squash up, mix it in with the chili, put that back into the spaghetti squash boat, and then you top it with cheese and put it back in the oven, so it's like a twice baked spaghetti squash. Or you could just plop the chili right on top of the squash as is and put the cheese and stick it in the oven. And then you have spaghetti squash underneath there, so it's a way for you to enjoy the vegetable as well, right? Because it's a vegetable at the end of the day. So it's a nice way to enjoy a vegetable, or add vegetable into a dish that maybe doesn't have any, say like a bolognese sauce, right? Maybe you don't want to add vegetables into the bolognese sauce, but by serving it in a little spaghetti squash boat, now you have some spaghetti squash in there, and it even kind of like, it kind of absorbs whatever flavors are in there. Of course, you'll also see spaghetti squash used as spaghetti, right? So this kind of ties into the conversation we had last week about cauliflower and how it's used to create a lot of different types of foods to replace more starchy carbohydrates. So this is a similar thing here, right? It is called spaghetti squash, and you'll see in a second as we pull the noodles, it's very noodly. So that's why it's called spaghetti squash, because the flesh of it looks like noodles. It looks like angel hair of any kind of pasta because it's very thin. But here's a couple things to consider. It has a completely different texture than regular pasta, right? It's crunchier and it is a vegetable, right? It's crunchy and it has kind of a mild but also sweet flavor. It does not mimic pasta, I will tell you that. So kind of like we were talking about last week, if you get satisfaction from the chewiness of starchy carbs like real pasta, or even a different kind of pasta, maybe it's like a chickpea based pasta or a lentil based pasta, any kind of pasta that is starchier, that adds satisfaction to your meal, right? So spaghetti squash is very low in calories, and if we take that out of the context of thinking about how many calories you eat in a day and how maybe that relates to your weight or your weight loss goals, right? Because that's how we kind of get in that mode of thinking because of all of the diet messaging out there. So we kind of get caught up in thinking that we just can't have real pasta. So, here's this thing that kind of resembles spaghetti. I'm going to eat that instead. But consider, for real, that the spaghetti squash it's very low in calories. And calories are not just something that impacts your weight. It's not just something that you play around with to have an impact on your weight. It's not just in the context of counting calories and how many calories can I have in a day or how many calories should I have in a day. Calories are your body's energy, and calories are what will help fill you up and help you feel satisfied. So if you full on replace the real pasta with spaghetti squash, you're getting a lot less calories. So again, taking that out of the context of thinking about weight, that could mean that your dinner is less satisfying, less filling. And maybe an hour later, you're hungry again for something more. Versus if you had had the real pasta, that might have kept you feeling satisfied for 3 or 4 hours. Maybe you didn't need to eat again at all the rest of the night. So it's the same conversation that we were having last week, essentially, that this spaghetti squash is very versatile and there's a lot that you can do with it, and there's nothing wrong with eating it topped with sauce and meatballs. There's nothing wrong with eating it like spaghetti and meatballs. But again, it's not a replacement for real spaghetti. It can be a fun way to get more veggies in. It can be a way to, maybe you aren't that hungry for dinner, right? Maybe you do want a less calorie dense meal because you had a big lunch and you want a lighter dinner, something like that. So yeah, then having the spaghetti squash is a good option instead of having the full bowl of pasta, right? So, and then we were also talking about the cauliflower, that you can create more volume by maybe doing something like half cauliflower rice and half real rice. So same thing here, maybe to cut down a little bit on the pasta so you're not having a huge bowl of pasta, you can do half real pasta and half spaghetti squash, kind of mix it in there. That's what I love to do with zucchini noodles also, right? Zoodles. I like to mix them together. So I'm adding more volume, I'm getting some veggies in, so I'm amping up the nutrient content, but I'm still enjoying my pasta and I'm still getting the satisfaction from that. So again, it's just that little mindset switch of not thinking of it as I can't have the pasta, I'm gonna have the spaghetti squash instead, or we're thinking of it as a replacement, but rather thinking of how can I use the versatility of the spaghetti squash to, to add more veggies, more nutrients, more variety, add some volume, or lighten up a dish. And again, thinking also, which we talked about last week too, just thinking about where your decisions are coming from. So is your decision to eat spaghetti squash with tomato sauce and meatballs instead of spaghetti with tomato sauce and meatballs? Is that coming from you, like I said, genuinely feeling like you don't want something so heavy, or whatever your reasoning is? Or is it coming from you feeling like you can't have the regular pasta, that having the regular pasta is going to completely derail you from your goals? Because that's just simply not the case, generally speaking, right? I don't know you personally, but generally speaking, that's not the case. So on that note, let's dig into the spaghetti squash. Okay. So where's my fork? Okay, so once the squash has cooled down slightly, just enough for you to handle it, you just go in there with a fork and start scraping. So the flesh will come from the sides and from the center of the squash. So that's a way to know, like I said, you want to pierce it and, you can't see, pierce it and it's nice and fork tender, but you also know it's done when it's easily shredding. So you shouldn't have to really be forcing it to shred. It should come nice and shredded. All right, so you just keep going through. You don't have to, you don't have to pull it all up. That's something else that I like about eating it right from the boat, is that as you're eating, you can kind of keep pulling more and more of the squash up from the bottom, because there's really a ton of squash in each half. All right, so that's all we're looking for there. And I kind of mix it up a little because you get the olive oil from, the olive oil and the salt and pepper is in the center there, right, where we seasoned it. So just kind of mix it up so that it all gets nice and flavored. So like I said, you can take all of the flesh out and put it in a bowl and mix it up to eat it on its own, or to mix it up with something and then stuff the boats. One of my favorite simple ways to enjoy it just on its own as a side dish, because it can just be served as a side dish as your vegetable, is to just mix it, take all the insides out, put it in a bowl, mix it with a little more olive oil, a little more salt and pepper to taste, and some Parmesan cheese, but like a hefty dose of Parmesan cheese. That's one of my favorite ways to enjoy it, just nice and simple. Because like I said, the spaghetti squash does have a nice taste on its own. It's pretty sweet on its own. But it also is pretty mild, so it will also kind of pick up the flavors of whatever you're mixing it with. So that's it for the spaghetti squash demo.